We've been waiting for this.
Yes, I have. Steve, as much as I love Hot Tub Time Machine, you are also responsible for what is my dad's favourite film and is one of my favourite films of all time. And it's, as much as I do love Hot Tub Time Machine, it's really what I wanted to speak to you about. You wrote Grosse Pointe Blank.
Mm-hmm.
And it is genuinely, and I don't mean to exaggerate because I'm speaking to you, it is one of my favourite films of all time. It is probably my fourth favourite film ever.
Why?
I think it's fantastic.
He has said this prior as well.
We can send you the screenshots of our group chat of me expressing my absolute love for this film. Why?
Yeah, why? Like, I appreciate that. I love the movie as well. I don't know if it's in my top 5, but I certainly love it.
I can tell you right now, I fucking love that film. It's right from the opening, from John Cusack to the opening with the failed assassination attempt to the crash to Dan Aykroyd popping out. The way he pops out of the shadows kills me every time. I think Joan Cusack, who I actually think is great in everything I see, I think she's fantastic as the assistant. Dan Aykroyd is another one of those actors, like with Chevy Chase in Hot Tub Time Machine. It's great to have almost a throwback, and Dan Aykroyd is great in it. Minnie Driver, you don't see a lot of. I think she's great. The music's fantastic, and I think if you're responsible for the music in the two films, which I sort of have to, the commonality between the films that I've seen of yours is always you. So Hi-Fi and American Sweethearts, the music's fantastic in all 4 of them. You even got Joe Strummer, who is the lead singer of my second favourite band ever to do the music for the film.
Oh, Joe, you're talking.
Yeah, you got Joe Strummer to do the music for the film.
Yeah, Joe. I mean, Joe's an extraordinary person, and I loved working with him. I mean, everything about that movie was so special. Obviously, it was my first movie. I was in my mid-20s. I didn't know any better, so there's always an advantage to not knowing any better, because we all were working hard to get what we wanted, no matter what. And there's like the studio and the director. I wasn't the director; I was just producer and writer, and so you would have clashes with the director and with the studio, but I was unaware that those clashes meant something, politically and socially. Like I think I probably would have been more politically astute or more or less maybe rude at times. But I didn't care. I was in my 20s. Like, the movie has to be like this. This is why we wrote it. That we wrote it this way specifically to have this feeling. And I can give you some examples. Like, and I learned a lot too. Obviously, I learned a ton. So like at that time, before we got going with making the movie, or even writing the movie, Johnny, I'd read a lot of scripts for Johnny, and I started working with him. We had a theater company together, and it was at that time in the early 90s where people wanted to put a gun in his hand. He was getting a lot of cop movies, a lot of spy movies, and he asked me what I thought of that, or I don't know if he asked me, but we were having a conversation about it at some point because we hung out every day. And I was like, if we're going to put a gun in your hand, I don't even know if I put it that way. I was like, if there's going to be a gun in your hand in a movie, there should be a gun in your hand ironically. Like, what is, like, we don't, like the whole idea of heroism in American culture at this time is something that we're not necessarily all for. Like, what are the complexities of taking another person's life in a way that affects the person who's the murderer, and like, what does it say about the killer, and what's it say about American culture and all that stuff. So we were like super young and super involved in all these ideas. So when the idea of a killer goes back to his high school reunion came up, we were like, well, this is perfect, because we have this guy who's totally detached from his emotional life, who is now being asked to go to be kind of thrust back into the center of what his young emotional life was. And yet he doesn't see the problem with, assassinating as a kind of lifestyle, which was a kind of fun idea. Like, the other kind of deeply thematic idea that we were working with that's not in the movie, or doesn't really play in any kind of real way in the movie, is the idea that, like, if the most successful person in America is an assassin, like, you make your own hours, you make tons of money, you wear nice clothes, you get to travel, you're like, what is like a kind of prototype American success story? And we're like, well, it's a Wall Street guy who murders people for money. Like, it just seemed like that archetype is the same. It's the same thing, right? Wealth, freedom, power. Like, that's a kind of American value for success, or American portrait of success, right? So what's an American portrait of success? We're like, well, that's super funny to us, right? That being an assassin is actually a kind of like, portrait of American success. So let's make him a portrait of American success. So it was like, that was kind of operating in the background. And the fact that he's going back to his high school reunion, right? Everybody wants to be successful when they go back to their high school reunion. They want to they were a success story. So we had him come back as the success story, albeit one that's, totally corrupted morally. Right? Like it's like totally like this problem of job choice. So we were so all these kinds of things went into to the kind of writing of the story.
Yeah.
And then when Dan Aykroyd came along, like one of the things I would say, the principal lesson I learned, this is the principal lesson I learned, and I might have this wrong because it's been so long, but this is what I remember. We weren't thrilled about Dan Aykroyd being in the movie. Like he had done Blues Brothers and Trading Places. He was like one of the funniest and best American comedians in the history of comedy. But it was early 90s and we're like, we're cool and he's not anymore. And he did some bad movies and we don't even care. And no, right? And I don't know if it was engineered this way or I probably was because people are so much fucking smarter than me around me. But and I'm sure I was pretty vocal about like, no to Dan Aykroyd, no, being like just a little, bitch. And they said, well, Dan wants to meet with you. And I was like, what? Like, Dan Aykroyd wants to meet with you and tell you why, his vision for the character.
Wow.
So now I'm like, why me? Like, this is a setup, right? Like, why me? Why not me? Like, there's the director, there's Cusack, there's the, it's just like, so they totally set me up, right? But what was brilliant about setting me up was not that they set me, so then you expect Dan Aykroyd to come in and be like, let me tell you a thing or two, you fucking little shit. I was like terrified, right? Because like, oh great, I'm now being in a position where I have to reject Dan Aykroyd. And what happened was he came in the room, and he's a delightful dude, he's a delightful person. And he started pitching me the most brilliant ideas for the movie I'd ever fucking heard. And it occurred to me during the course of that meeting, not only was I a terrible idiot, a judgmental, pretentious little idiot, but that the lesson was, if you have a vision for something, it doesn't matter what station you are in the business. Like if you have pitch will travel. Are you passionate about something? It doesn't matter whether people like you or don't like you or think of you as X or Y. It's like, if you have a passion for it, you should go for it. It's because here's Dan Aykroyd who taught me that lesson. He doesn't have to meet with me. They paid him, 7 figures to do our movie, right? For like a couple of weeks work, right? So he doesn't have to do our movie. He doesn't have to fucking come and pitch some bullshit first time writer, right? None of that setup really should have taken place, except for Dan, who was passionate about the idea and didn't give a fuck who he was pitching to. He wanted to express his ideas for the movie. And he comes in and every idea in the movie is his. He comes in, he starts saying, he says, I want to wear like a Mao jacket. Right. I'm like, okay, that's brilliant. Why do you want to? It's like, because he's like, because it's international and it's weird. And it's like, I want to be that's how I kind of want my costume. But I want to do like a military shaved cut. He's like, so I'm going to be like this weird post-Vietnam military hard case, but with this like weird, like fashion sense. And I'm like, okay. And then he says, and I don't want to have a bunch of big guns. He goes, I like the big nickel plated, revolvers for the doorman, because that works. Yeah. But he's like, for that hit, that's a very specific hit. But he's like, but generally like my weapon of choice, my style will be to have a bunch of little 22s, because like, I don't want to reload. Like, I'm a guy who doesn't want to reload, right? And even semi-automatics at 15, 16, you're going to have to reload. It's like, I want to have like 8 22 caliber revolvers on me, right? So 6 times 8, he's got 48 rounds. 6 times 8 is 42, right? 42. What is 6 times 8?
48, yeah.
48, yeah. So it's like he has like almost 50 rounds on him at any given time. And so he's like, and after I finish firing them, I throw them away, right? And I'm like, oh, I see. I'm an idiot and you're a genius. Lesson learned. Like, that's the lesson. Like, don't ever judge anyone at any time just because you have a perception of what you think they are or you think they can do. because it's probably false. It is most assuredly false. And so that was just a huge lesson for me. And I walked out of there being like, God, I'm an asshole. And two, we would be lucky to get Dan Aykroyd. Like also putting the gun in the paper bag, that little shot where he's walking into the diner and he has a lunch bag. Like, again, like genius, right? Because it's like, how would you, how do you carry a gun somewhere? Like in this not, like even if you got frisked, like maybe I guess they look in the bag, but it's like the most unassuming little move ever. So yeah, it was a great lesson for me about like how you operate in Hollywood, and it, you can see how good he is in the movie.
He is fantastic. He is brilliant. The other question is, and I don't know if this is ever something that was brought to your attention, but when you look at the film now online, there's the unofficial sequel whereby John and Joan Cusack reprise their roles. He's an assassin, she's his assistant. Did anyone ever approach you about making a second, or was it just let John Cusack's character ride off into the sunset?
I mean, we talked about it for years. I think it wasn't. There was many different forces. Like one of the forces. Well, force number one, Joe Roth, who was the producer of the movie, became the chairman of Disney, and he gave us High Fidelity to make. So we went from Blank to working on High Fidelity. So we knew that was going to be our next movie, no matter what.
Yeah.
Then now you have a couple of years passing, and it's just a question of like, will the studio make a sequel? Time started to change. It was successful, but I think it grew it grew way more successful. Like I don't even know how well it did in its initial box office run. It just became so much more successful after that. I think its growing popularity over time was great. But I think the studio is kind of like, do we make another dark comedy like that? And I think it was almost like we got away with it. Like I'm so happy for Barry right now, because it's like for years I tried to get, and I know a lot of people tried to get like an assassin comedy on television, like a la Grosse Pointe Blank, and everyone would be like, well, no one's gonna, went back to the same problem that we had when we had John, which was even when we had John and we were trying to make the movie, we were like, well, how are you gonna empathize with a killer in a comedy?
Yeah.
Like, that was always a thing. I was like, well, because we have John Cusack. What are you asking me? Like John Cusack appears on the screen and you have empathy for him because he evokes it. Like his natural state is someone you want to root for. So that's why it works. Yes. Will it have worked with, Robert Davi? No, probably not. I don't know if you guys know who that actor is. He's like an old school villain, like 80s villain actor. You can look him up after this interview. But like, yeah, if you cast, a kind of villainous mug, then yes, the movie won't work. But it works because of John and where John came from. Like, Can Say Anything, like everything he carries with him into the film, people are going to be aware of. So it's like, you just got to find an actor like that who just evokes this sense of empathy and rooting interest for your character and their work. And they're like, yeah. So when I saw Barry, I was like, oh my God, it's so genius, because it's operating in the same way. You have this guy whose life feels empty and he wants something more, and yet he's stuck in this job he doesn't like, all of which you can kind of identify and relate to, even if he wasn't a killer, right? Like people wanting to do something with their lives besides the thing that they're doing, which makes them unhappy, But I'm super happy I'm super flattered that you like it that much. It means a lot.
Like is an understatement. I'll be honest. It is very much an understatement. But no, thank you very much for speaking to me about it. And